Hello, everyone. Welcome to One Night Stand by Intuit, the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art. My name is Paula Santos. I am the Senior Manager of Learning and Engagement here at Intuit. I welcome you to this very special program, which is just all of us together discussing one work by one artist for a short amount of time, definitely long enough to get into the deep looking and deep thinking about the life and work of an artist. Tonight, we will be talking about the artist Martín Ramírez. His work is currently at Intuit at the exhibition, the collection of Victor F. Keane, which will be open through the end of the year. So with that said, I encourage all of you to participate, to chime in. I expect this to be more of a conversation. I definitely don't want it to seem like a lecture where you get to listen and not chime in with your comments or questions. So please feel free to contribute to the conversation. I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Okay, so I'm going to present, or I'm going to put this in presentation mode and begin playing a song, and I'll let it play for about a minute, and I want you to just take it in, let it transport you to wherever your mind takes you.
Si vas en ferrocarril para saber dónde estás, te fijas en lo que gritan y al instante lo sabrás. Cuando el tren vaya corriendo, como quien se va del lado, y oyes hablar de los guajes, es que llegaste a Silao. Y si el tren se para pronto y se te acerca un chamaco gritando, ¡vendo frijoles! Es que estás en Apizaco.
So what you were just listening to is called a corrido, and this corrido is called El Ferrocarril, which means train in Spanish, the train in Spanish. And a corrido is a very popular narrative song that forms a ballad, and these songs tell stories, they share histories, they talk about the oppression that many people have experienced, they talk about the daily life for working people, for peasants, and other socially relevant topics. It is definitely an art form that throughout the time of Martín Ramírez's life was very popular. That was one way that you got to know the news. He migrated to the United States in 1925, and that period of time in Mexico, for example, was incredibly tumultuous. There was a revolution. Mexico wasn't quite Mexico as we know it today. So the reason I began with that song called El Ferrocarril is because the art of Martín Ramírez shares many similarities to that song in its subject matter, but also because of who he was as a person. Now, before I begin talking about how his journey to the United States contributes to the way that he works on his drawing, his life through the end of it, I invite you to look with me. So I want you to spend just a few moments looking at this work of art. Just notice it from corner to corner. Is there anything that stands out to you? And you feel free to share that. You can unmute yourself, or also you can share it in the chat.
One thing that stands out to me is the sense of movement and the vibrating patterns of the landscape.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of movement. I, have mentioned the train multiple times now, and there is this sense of motion from one train here and then the other train here. And Allison, you're also pointing out the movement of these lines that we see all across the drawing. And they're moving also in different directions. What else do we notice?
We have a comment that I'm surprised by how much red and pink is in this mostly black and white image.
Yeah, so perhaps when we first look at this image, we can see the lines and we see the movement, as Allison pointed out. But the more you look, the more you start to see where there is color in this work. Right here, where you see this doorway or this entrance, maybe to a tunnel, you see the orange that is peeking out. You also see this brown. And if you look closely, even in between the lines here, in between these dark lines, you get bits of color. You see some orange here. I know that there's a little bit of yellow, so in between some of the lines here too. So Ramirez, while most of his drawing is in this kind of monochrome, white, black, you do get those little spots of color the more you spend time with the work. What else do you see?
It's nearly symmetrical. It's maddeningly not quite symmetrical, but nearly so. And I'm curious about that choice.
And where do you notice the symmetry?
Well, the basic structure, I think the way the space is divided, and the way the vehicles, the trains, are positioned. They're almost exactly, it's almost half and half, but it isn't really quite. So I'm very curious about what went into that.
Yeah, you're pointing out the fact that we have two trains. We have two entrances to the tunnels, right? One on the far left, one in the middle. And then we also have these two parts of the drawing that look like, to me, they always look like columns. But they could also be like, if you've ever been on the subway or in the train here in Chicago, when you look up and you see the ceiling of the train, when you're underground, I also think about that sort of like that tunnel here towards the middle. And one thing I do want to point out about the physical object about this drawing, when you see it in person, you can see that there is definitely this space here where the two parts that you're noticing, Phyllis, are joined. And you notice here in the middle that where the lines end here don't quite match up to where the lines begin in the other part of the drawing. So it does feel like if you folded it up, maybe it would meet right from edge to edge. But the closer you look, you see actually it's not quite as straightforward as that.
Right.
One thing I'll say about Ramirez's process is that he very much was particular about the materials that he used. He began drawing in about 1935. And he was well into his 40s by that point. He found himself in an institution, in a hospital, and that's where he landed after spending some time working in the United States, and I'll go back to that in a second. But what I want to say is that when he began drawing, he began collecting different types of materials, different types of surfaces that he could begin drawing on. So when you look at this work, especially, and I think I have a more close detail of this. Yeah, I'm just gonna go here for a second. You start noticing that he glued sheets of paper together, and all of these sheets of paper for this particular drawing were ruled paper, kind of like you had if you were, just using a notebook. So that's one of the surfaces he uses, but he also used like nurses' pads, like paper from nurses' pads. He used some of the examination paper, which if you can imagine, it is kind of like this crinkly, sort of see-through, maybe waxy paper. So he was very particular about what he used. As he began his drawing practice in the 1930s, the people around him in the hospital and, outsiders that would come visit, that would either give drawing classes or professors of psychology, since he was in a mental health institution, they would offer him materials. They would offer him, higher quality watercolors, for example. He was known to make pigments out of just natural substances he had, like juice or something like that. So the person who mentioned the bits of color here, perhaps it's like one of those diluted inks or diluted paints that he made. So, you get a little bit of that sense of where that color might have come from. Yeah, so I'll leave it there. What are you curious about as you spend more time looking at this piece, and especially as you see this detail? What comes to the surface? What questions do you have?
I'm curious about what compelled the artist to draw a train, and sort of where is this train going, and I want to know about what's happening.
Yeah, we've, in our conversation so far, we have focused so much on the train, right? And perhaps where it's going, there are tunnels that we see. And I want to bring us back here to this portrait of Ramirez in the 1920s. So Martín Ramírez was born in Los Altos, Jalisco, in 1895. And by 1925 or so, he migrated from Mexico to Texas and then to California. In his journey, he took the train. And as I was looking into what was the cultural and political context for this migration, because, migrations don't necessarily happen just for the sake of them. There's usually a lot of reasons for why that is. As I mentioned earlier, Mexico as a country was truly finding itself. There was a revolution at the turn of the 20th century, and there was still a lot of unrest and very, very little work in the 1920s. Mexico as we know it, with muralism, this return to this indigenous idea, this mestizaje as you call it, that wasn't really formed until the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So there were still quite a few decades of this formation of Mexico. In the meantime, you had many men like Martín Ramírez migrate from their hometowns to where there was readily available work. And the United States, as it was industrializing, as it was finding riches, gold in California, as it was started mining, as it started having slaughterhouses, etc., had such an intense appetite for labor. So Ramirez and 3 of his friends at the time boarded this train and came to the United States. One thing that I think is interesting here and can help us perhaps, give us a little bit of insight into Ramirez and especially for what happened in the rest of his life is that many of these Mexican migrant workers intended to return home. They were going to the United States to earn money, to send back home, and to bring money with them. Ramirez left a wife and children in Mexico, fully intending to perhaps send money back or return with money and just kind of live on his life in Mexico. Needless to say, plans don't always go as you thought that they would. And many men either decided to stay in the United States or for one reason or another didn't quite accomplish their goals. But yeah, I mean, the context around men like Ramirez coming to the United States really puts into focus then what happens later once he is in the hospital. So here we have an image of Ramirez, the drawing, and the more you look at his images, the more that you notice that his line is so recognizable. The movement that you were all discussing before appears in his other drawings, not always of trains. Sometimes his drawings are, as Deb in the chat points out, perhaps some nostalgic scenes of his life in Mexico. For example, he draws the jinete, which is this very traditional kind of man on a horse, very, Jalisco is one of the homes of jinetes, very particular to that part of Mexico. You also have images of Madonna, and the sociologist Victor Espinoza has done some research to link those images that Ramirez made with very, very particular Catholic imagery in his hometown. So there's some evidence that, these are memories that Ramirez had and was exploring while, he was in the United States in a hospital. So, you may be wondering how did Ramirez end up being in a hospital for the rest of his life? He did end up dying at the DeWitt Hospital after, 32 years or so of being in a mental health institution. So, as I mentioned, he came to the United States in 1925. And if we can think back to our US history, in 1929, there was a huge economic shock in the country. The Great Depression, all of that hunger for labor was just something that wasn't there anymore. Ramirez, unfortunately, became homeless after losing his job. There are accounts that the police found him acting erratically, that no one could quite make sense of what he was saying or what was happening. And, he spoke Spanish. So the language barrier was also something that throughout his stay in the hospital continued to be an issue. And then the book that I'm mentioning by Victor Espinoza, he goes a little bit into how the fact that he didn't always have a translator impacted the level of care and the type of care he received while he was in these mental health institutions. And as I mentioned, many men, including Ramirez, did intend to return home. And for Ramirez, he never got the chance to. He did, write a couple of letters that his family talks about. And I believe he even met with a family member while he was at the hospital. But he never really discussed his artwork. He discussed, just whatever you would talk about to a cousin, like, how's everyone back home? What's happening? So that's a little bit of background here. So let's go here. So now that I've shared some of the circumstances around Ramirez's life and some of the hardships that led him to be in a mental health institution, is there anything that comes to mind as you look at the work again?
So you mentioned,
go ahead, Lindsay.
Thanks. So you mentioned that lines appear frequently in his works. Is that sort of a option or something that was soothing to him? Do we know?
I don't know that anyone has specifically talked about it being like a soothing, right? However, especially in this genre and outsider art, self-taught art, there is this motif that keeps coming up, which is the patterns and the repetition of things. It's also a way, at least in Ramirez's work, of perhaps even thinking about moving hills, or a landscape that moves, or topography that changes. And I'll show you some examples of other train scenes he had, but those lines continue to appear. And even when he's drawing other motifs, the area of Mexico where he's in definitely has hills. I mean, Los Altos means the heights. Los Altos de Jalisco is the heights. So that would be my interpretation. Yeah. Anything else? Allison, you were going to say something before.
Yes, I was thinking about how meaningful this subject must have been for Ramirez and what's involved in sort of creating something, kind of what that means to create, and how it is that this object this wonderful work of art has come to us, has been preserved and maintained, and knowing, in addition to this wonderful example, that it's a theme that he recurred to, just thinking about what this must have meant to Ramirez and how it must have had some special significance to him, or like with any art, it wouldn't exist. And so kind of pondering kind of the how and why of the piece. It's just all the more, I think, interesting to think about when you think about the circumstances in which it was made, and also this very dramatic size and scale of the work.
Yeah, I'm glad I mean, there's a few things to draw out of your comment, but the one I will start with is that it is a long piece, 78 inches. What is that, like 7 feet? Is 7-ish feet? So it is, taller than, or as tall as a basketball player, and 17 inches. So, a couple of feet tall, or a foot and a half tall. And I think as when we were talking about the paper quality, there was also this like scroll-like quality to the work where you can read it kind of from one end to another. And whenever I look at it, Intuit would never let me do this, but I do wonder what it sounds like if you kind of like roll it up. It also has that quality of it. You kind of want to roll it up like a scroll. I think one thing I do, what your comment made me think, Allison, is that while he was, especially at DeWitt Hospital, and he began drawing, he was such a prolific draftsman. And he was also, in many ways, a very precise draftsman. So one of the remembrances from people who knew him at the time is there's this image where he put the drawing on the floor, and then he would kind of stand on the table so he could see the composition of the drawing, from a different vantage point. So, to me, that is this image of like, he was planning out his drawing, right? Like that, this section will be this section and this will be that. There's also other people who mention that he would work little by little and like unfurl his paper as he's drawing, which very different techniques. So I really wonder if he like employed one versus another depending on the subject matter. But one of the most beautiful images that sort of come to mind as I was doing research on his work is that, he made many drawings that were, as large as this one. And we only have what we have, he wasn't a famous artist when he was in these institutions. So who knows what we lost in the meantime, but that he would hang up his work. And there's this one remembrance of someone saying that he hung it up on a door and the air would hit the paper and it would just kind of flow. And the paper would just kind of flow like a curtain, which just kind of gives us like another life, this kind of like living drawing. A different type of existence than the one it definitely has now. So now I definitely want to open it to just general questions. Here's another example of a train piece. And this was a quite different train. This is a more modern train. So the train that we had in the main piece that we looked at was more of that steam engine train, which is a lot more similar to the one that he would have traveled in, or that he would, he worked on the railroad tracks. So he would have laid tracks for. And this is far more modern, so it means that he probably kept up with the newest technology in his lifetime.
Paula, is this a detail or is it the whole drawing?
It's the whole drawing.
Wow.
This is the whole drawing.
Interesting composition, I think.
Yes.
Such a sense of drama.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it has like this roller coaster feel to it.
Yeah.
It also has those like Art Deco lines. Whenever I look at this, I think about those like really like confident lines, of like Art Deco, just architectural details. there's one more I think that I added here
Mm.
to an earlier point about color. Now here we don't have the train anymore. And these dates I have here are the ones that have been agreed upon. However, he never dated his work, so we don't really know. It's hard to know, like, was there a progression in his drawing? Like, is it that he became interested in color later on in his career? Since things aren't dated, you can't really make those kinds of interpretations.
Do I remember at one point reading a little bit about him? Somebody was collecting his work with the staff of the hospitals that he was in, where he was staying. They were collecting. At least one person was collecting the work.
Yes, there were a couple of people in his orbit. One was his last name was Pasto, who was very, very interested in who he was as an artist. And the other person escapes my mind, but they did recognize his work. Like, he was recognized for his work in his lifetime. Not in the way that we think about now with artists that have gallery representations and things are sold, but there was definitely attention to him. In fact, the Pasto, the person who I just mentioned, brought his class to come observe him drawing. Because he had made a name for himself as this interesting artist, and they came and observed his process.
I'm sorry, what kind of class was Pasto teaching?
He was a professor of psychology, so
interesting.
Yeah. And I have to say that a lot of the writing on Ramirez's work is very it's the center of it is this diagnosis of schizophrenia, and the way that his drawing came from that place of a diagnosis, which is incredibly sensitive because, as I mentioned, he didn't always have the interpreter with him. And it was later on when Victor Espinosa did a lot more research that we have a little bit more insight into what was happening in terms of his care while he was there. Are there any other?
And none of the people that worked with him in the hospitals, nobody ever asked him his thoughts about the imagery that he was using, I suppose.
I mean, that's a really good question. If they did ask him, that's been lost to time. Yeah, because I think even Victor Espinosa in the research, and I'm so curious to know like his sources, which is why I've looked at them, is that even finding Ramirez's medical records happened completely by chance. Because the hospital had, they have like a time schedule of when they get rid of, old medical records. They hadn't gotten to the portion of Ramirez's records. Mm. So it was totally by chance. So if there were things in his records or people who knew him, it's kind of lost to time. Mm. Yes, we have a comment in the chat about how Chicago Imagists, Jim Nutt and Gladys Nielsen were early collectors, and just further solidify Chicago's standing in the outsider art being recognized. Well, thank you so much for sharing this time with me and looking at Ramirez's work so closely. I really appreciate your time. And thank you so much. And I hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Paula.
Bye.
Thank you.